Mhm. Yeah. Well, good evening. On behalf of the Society of Professional Journalists, New England Pro Chapter, my name is Irwin Gratz. Our guest this evening is Jayson Blair. Now, if you're a journalist and the name rings a bell, it's because you remember Jayson resigned from the New York Times after it was uncovered that he had committed some basic journalistic sins, plagiarizing, fabricating. But there's much more to this story, too. Two top editors were also forced to resign for presiding over a management culture that it was said had failed, both Jayson as a young reporter and the Times audience. What led to all of this, what Jayson has done with his life since, or what we want to discuss tonight. Jayson Blair, thank you for joining us.
Of course,
And
appreciate you having me.
And a reminder, if you are interested, Jayson's also happy to take questions from our audience this evening. You can either raise your hand, I think we can work it that way, or feel free to drop something in chat and I'll keep an eye on that. You know, it's been almost 20 years now, Jayson, believe it or not, since you left the Times. And I think one of the interesting parts of the story is what you've done with your life since then. I'm not sure everyone knows. Tell our audience what you're doing now for a living.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. And and the interesting thing is it's some parts of it are so similar to journalism. So I work as a coach, so both a life coach, mental health coach, and I also do some leadership coaching work. I basically run a company that has a bunch of people who are in the leadership coaching space. But I'm in a company that's really founded based on my own experience, what happened to me at the Times, what I did at the Times, what I learned from that experience. And I think in many different ways, I say to people often, if I had to go back through it all over again to learn the lessons that I did, I would do it. It's a very hard thing to say because it was a very difficult experience and difficult process, but I do think it was a humbling process, and it gave me an opportunity to see a lot of my own weaknesses and failings, and the fact that to grow more sympathy for others. And then, I had mental health challenges that intersected. I don't think they're responsible for the scandal, but certainly made it more complicated and harder. So around 2010, well, actually 2007, I started coaching in the mental health arena. I had done some volunteering and work there, and then founded this group that focused on mental health and has expanded to help people in lots of different areas. And and my team, the people who work for me, say the same thing. Everything sort of grew out of that experience. It's been the good that's come out of it, touched lots of lives. So.
How does it connect to, how does what you do now connect to journalism?
Well, so the similar parts are, you spend a lot of time in my space, the mental health space, convincing people to tell you their stories, often very reluctant to tell their stories, and asking the right probing questions, being able to sort of put life into a narrative. The only real difference is I don't publish what I hear now. Instead, I use it to, the upside here is I get to stay with the story through its fruition long after it's out of the news. But those are the similar things. And I really find the journalistic skills to be unbelievably helpful, being able to put people at ease, particularly when you're dealing with and talking about tough issues. Being able to help people find that narrative for themselves and that story and understand the different pieces. It's very, very similar. And I think also another element to it is journalism as a profession, of its many important things. One of the most important things about journalism is that it helps people. That line about, afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted, those parts are very similar. Although we don't do a lot of work here afflicting anything on anyone. It's mostly the opposite, but all those parts are very similar. I mean, I would say I got into this work, I love journalism for a lot of different reasons, but one of the reasons I love journalism is because it could have a positive impact on the world. So I sort of feel lucky that I have been able to find a profession where I have an opportunity to do that. I mean, I love journalism. It's definitely my first love as a profession, but I also know no matter what I've learned, what I've gone through, or how I've gotten better, it's not where I belong, because journalism ultimately is so much about trust. But I feel like I'm lucky because a lot of people who go through situations like this or commit sort of sins in their profession like this don't get an opportunity to use that exact experience to go help people. So
Yeah,
I know that was a long-winded answer.
that's okay. And we may come back to some of this later, but I do want to spend a while talking about your stint in journalism.
Mhm.
You've said in other forums that you didn't all of a sudden turn into a plagiarizing, fabricating reporter, but that it began with small violations. What kind and why?
Yeah, so the why is a tough one. I don't. David Carr, in his book, The Night of the Gun, said that, he'd read all the stories, he'd talked to me over and over again, and he still couldn't wrap his head around, why I did it. I think his quote was something like, Jayson just, uh, tied a rope around his neck, tied the other end around us, and then jumped off the side of the building. But I do think, I have some thoughts on the why. I think the why is kind of complicated. I think the why, to your point, did have something to do with the management culture at the time. We were running and gunning. It did have something to do with, I think, a lot of what was going on with me. I was young, I was immature, I was very, very prideful, right? I was afraid to ask for help. So when I started to have problems, I sort of felt like that wasn't an option. One part of my story is that a year before the scandal started, I had gone to rehab. And part of what had happened is the Times had helped me get there and go there. So I felt like I couldn't ask again. And then I also feel like for me, um, yes, some of it was ambition, but I don't think ambition led to the fabrication. I think ambition led to the not being willing to ask for help. So I think pride played a huge role in it. Stress played a huge role in it. So when the stress and the mental health issues kick in, it's really my pride in my mind, right? That I believe I can handle this. I'm not going to ask for help. Um, Rod, I'll jump to that one in a second, but that I'm not going to ask for help um, really led to it. And where it started, actually, right? So, and imagine the stress. It was actually, I remember the first time it happened, it was actually lifting a quote from an Associated Press story. I had been sent on a man on the street, freaked out for some reason that I don't understand, didn't get the quote that I needed, pulled a quote, should have attributed it to the Associated Press, sent it to the desk in the story, saw it, thought as I was leaving, I need to go to the copy desk and tell them to attribute it to the Associated Press. For whatever reason, I didn't. I was convinced in that moment I was dead. The next morning, they would all figure it out. And then it didn't happen. So I think for me, I didn't do anything after that per se for a long time, but the seed was planted in my head. And so I think then when more stress or different stress hit, that little seed was there in the back of my mind. And you talk to a lot of people who are in scandals, we're often focusing on the big thing in the big moment. But you talk to a lot of them, and there was some kind of seed they planted in their own head or that was planted in their head earlier. They crossed some line long before the big thing that we noticed. Is it okay if I answer Rod's question?
Sure, go ahead. And just for the record,
No.
let's read it out so that people
Yep.
have it. I mean, and Ron essentially says, wait a minute, you said if you had to do it all over again, you would do the exact same thing, even as you damage the credibility of the American press. You don't believe there were other ways to learn the lessons you learned?
Absolutely. Definitely. There are a lot easier ways to learn the lessons. Now, when I'm saying that I would have done it all over again, I don't mean I would have done. I'm not looking to do the actions, but what I mean is if I had to go through that very difficult, painful experience to learn the lessons I did, as painful as it was, I would have gone through it again. I wouldn't wish it. Like if you told me somehow that was the only way I was going to learn the lessons I did, my life, other people's lives, it would be worth it to go through it. Even, take it out of the journalism arena. It could be some other kind of scandal. It could be some other crisis. I feel like for me, I would not have liked, even if I had stayed, even if I had been successful, I would not have liked the person I would have become. It wouldn't have, and I would have not been diagnosed until much later. So as hard and as tough as it was, and as painful as it was for me and for my family, there's a lot of critical good that came out of it, if that makes sense.
Interesting.
So it's less of wanting to do something like that again or thinking specifically like that. It's more of, I guess I'm referring to the feeling of it, what I went through, not so much the impact of it.
I guess I was kind of curious though, because a lot of times several of us on this call interact with younger journalists. I mean, did you come away with any lessons that you would impart to a young journalist to keep them from straying over that line the first time, planting that seed?
Yeah, no, so I don't talk a lot to a lot of groups, but I do talk to journalism classes often. And some of the things that we talk about, obviously we talk about the pride, we talk about taking care of, increasingly people want to talk about taking care of your mental health. Spend a lot of time talking to them about the idea of how compromises happen in small ways. A lot of people in the profession are very ambitious, and it is very easy to start running and running and running and losing absolute sight of why you originally got into the profession. I also think for a lot of people in journalism in general, one of the real challenges is that I think a lot of the emotional stuff that people deal with, they don't adequately process, right? There's a reason why you can find so many journalists in a bar on any given night. You know, so dealing with those issues head on, being more open about them, managing your stresses, being willing to sort of step back and say no, or that you're not ready, or that you can't handle something is really critical. So I push people toward vulnerability, right? Because one of the lessons for me is if I had been willing to be as vulnerable as I am now, it would have been bad, but none of the scandal would have happened.
Yeah. I mean, you've consistently taken responsibility for all those mistakes that you've made, but I guess it also has to be asked, do you think Times management should have done more to better guide and oversee you, especially as a young reporter?
Yes. But I do think a lot of it had to do with the particular time that we were in. It's sort of the beginning of sort of the internet becoming prominent, and there was a lot of pressure at the time. There was an executive editor change from Joe Lelyfeld to Hal Raines, and one of the things that Hal really wanted to do, his phrase for it was flood the zone. You throw everything at a story at a given point. You publish as fast as you can. As one editor said to me, his philosophy was, well, you get it wrong today on the front page, you can always write it the opposite way on the next day, which is not the normal Times way of operating, as you can imagine. So it was a big culture shift. There were clearly lots of different sides on the issues. And one of the things that I think happened with management, they became frayed and they were in camps. So it's not like the systems weren't there to manage me as a young reporter. It's just that the people who were responsible for that management are no longer talking to the senior leadership, and they're people are pawns in their fights against each other, it's really easy, because you guys have all seen it in organizations that you've covered. It's really easy for things to slip through the cracks. And one of the things that happened were, I think things slipped through the cracks for more than one young reporter at that time.
Hmm.
And even, I mean, and let me throw in another one, Judy Miller.
Yeah.
You know, I think most of you guys know Judy was a Times investigative reporter. Very, very talented, great reporter. But prior to Howell getting there, Judy worked in a pod with Steve Erlinger and several other editors. And the whole sort of point of putting that team together was that Judy pushed it to the wall, sometimes made leaps in logic, but having that right editor with her got the story to the right spot. And so when Hal came in, he was like, we've got to get Judy's stories in the paper faster. And it just sort of broke apart the system that existed to protect things. And I think to some extent, as much as my situation probably had more to do with me, and the supervision part probably had less to do with, or had more to do with how long it went on and how management didn't get in the way. I really look at Judy Miller's situation and say it would have never, ever happened without those changes.
You told us earlier that you still love journalism. I'm curious, how do you connect with the news these days?
Sure. Same way as everybody else, like 19 apps on my phone. And, getting the newspaper. I'm still friends with a lot of journalists too. So it's always nice to hear what's happening in the background. But, I am a ridiculous consumer of news. I probably have subscriptions to maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 different kinds of publications, podcasts. I love it for, I think I have an appreciation for the news in the sense being a former journalist, understanding what it takes. I was reading a story over the weekend in the Times about the Haitian president who was assassinated, and just thinking about all the work, I know all the steps, all the risk, all the things that go into pulling a story together like that. So I have a great appreciation and I completely consume it. You look at the year of the pandemic, for those of us who are out here dealing with it, it's what keeps us informed. It's what's kept us safe. It's what's, cut through the lies. So it's, yeah.
You mentioned the one story in the Times. Who in general do you think is doing journalism well these days?
I think the Times is still doing journalism well. The Washington Post is still doing journalism well. I think that there's a lot of good journalism happening in podcasts. I think television for me has become less of a place of good journalism. You can occasionally see some quote unquote news, facts about events that happened, and then lots of opinion. Not to say that there isn't good, television out there. There's still very good shows, but I have a harder time sort of finding it there.
All right. Let's go back to another question from the chat.
Mhm.
And it's basically, how could or should your editors have caught the issues that you raised sooner? What lessons can editors and managers take away?
Mhm. So I think it comes back to that main thing about management, leadership truly being focused on building the team as opposed to, and I think it's dangerous for me to try to ascribe motives, really what they were focused on. But I can tell you one thing they weren't focused on was really building the team successfully, focusing on not just the young reporters, but there are all sorts of problems that happened during that time. They weren't journalistic scandals, but they were definitely ball drops from a management and a people management perspective. So I think keeping your eye on the prize in that sense is a very, very important one. Building in management controls that and monitoring techniques that are not dependent on everybody getting along, or, tripwires that warn you of different things, I think would be an important thing. And having those systems and processes. Like, a disappointment for me was the Times eliminating its ombudsman. But I do think having their standards editor was a great move and a great approach. But I think that ombudsman becomes an awesome tripwire, because there are things that people in and outside the newsroom are going to bring to an ombudsman, the public is going to bring to an ombudsman, that they're not going to feel like that they can bring to management. And the other advantage of an ombudsman, just like when they exist in a federal agency or private corporation, is they have a different power to, or ability to speak truth to power. There's not the same risk for them. They can go to the boss and say, you are screwing this up. So those are all things, that I think are helpful in any newsroom, and frankly, other organizations too.
Another question, do you believe that had that seed you talked about not been planted by lifting that AP quote, would you have strayed into those dark journalistic places later, or was it inevitable?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard for me to say whether it would have been inevitable. I mean, I think for me, on a personal level, there would have been a breakdown no matter what, right? I mean, I wasn't going to de-stress myself or do the things that put me in an environment, whether it's in journalism, outside of journalism. And I don't know, something led me to do that in my mind. So there's nothing to say that something else wouldn't have led me to do it in my mind either. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it's a possibility. I also think, from my perspective, there are things like that happen. And there are things like that were kind of like a little bit in our institutional culture. By that, I mean, like, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Times of that time, but like Bigfooting, at the time, we didn't give our stringers credit. There were all sorts of things right on the edge of not so hot that kind of point in that direction. So I don't really know, but I certainly couldn't guarantee that if I hadn't done that piece, something else would have come up. What I can say is that's at least the start of the slippery slope for me. I know, unsatisfying answer probably.
No, well, it'll be interesting to see if there's a follow-up to that. I have noticed, I think one or two individuals may have joined us. If you do have a question for Jayson, please feel free to put it in the chat. From Kelly Conway, comment for starters, nothing but respect for a man who rises from the ashes. And then it goes on, not knowing the details of those stories, were you creating facts to make the story fit your narrative, or were you saving the work of getting the information quotes through legitimate channels?
Yeah, so it was a mix. So I would say the vast majority of it was simply trying to do the story right. And by what right, I mean getting things factually accurate. So I'll give an example of a story that lines up. There was a story where I was supposed to go to a home and talk to a family in Maryland. For all sorts of reasons, I didn't end up doing it. I was having a bit of a internal crisis, and looking back, it was anxiety about all sorts of different things. So instead of going there, I interviewed the people on the phone. I looked at pictures of their house, their neighborhood, used real facts, right? Real facts to tell the story, but just was disingenuous about being there. There are a lot of the stories were along those lines. So that kind of fits the bucket of fabrication. As you get further along in the arc of it, it moves from sort of like that kind of stuff to that stuff mixed with a lot of errors too. So it becomes a real witch's brew of mess at the end of plagiarism, fabrication, and errors at the same time. Does that answer the question? Was that Kelly?
Yeah, and Kelly, if you want to unmute and follow up, that would be okay too, I think. But I will try. Yep, there she is. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay,
Okay, perfect.
good. So what worries you, Jason, about journalism now?
Oh, good Lord. All those old things. I mean, if I could go through a long list, probably the biggest thing that worries me about journalism right now is that so much of it is not so much of what is called journalism is not reality based. It's based on people's opinions and perspectives, and that there's been this bleed between what I traditionally would consider journalism and what's being practiced or called journalism in a lot of quarters today. That's really the opinion side, just like any other person's opinion. Um, Probably the second thing for me too is if the pace and the expectations of speed over quality were ridiculous for us during that time with Hal, just based on talking to younger journalists and student journalists and seeing the output, I feel like it's doubled. And I worry about that in terms of accuracy. I worry about that in terms of picking the right stories, which may even be more important than the other stuff. And I also worry about it in terms of the fact that people don't have the time to really think things through. And so we don't get that same level of nuanced coverage. That's why, when you gave me that list, like you said, who does it really well, it's a short list. And that I think on that short list of people who consistently do it really, really well, a lot of it has to do with the time, the resources they're willing to put into it, and the fact that they're willing to throw things down or slow things down so people can really think and explore different angles.
Yeah, certainly our current media culture, I don't think allows a lot of time per se. Um,
And it's not to
What-
say that there aren't great journalists in other places and great organizations. It's just the consistency on that. Sorry.
Yeah, no, and I think that's fair. And I mean, the other thing that I know strikes many of us is that we're simply losing resources. I mean, outside of major markets, it's becoming very difficult, if not impossible, to maintain a cadre of journalists from a business standpoint, and that clearly affects the quality of journalism, at least on a more local level.
And
Um,
that's actually another thing too, that there's not a business model. There's a business model for the Times, there's a business model for the large publications, but there's not a real business. Online advertising is not going to do it. So that's also another concern. And not everyone's going to be able to get subscriptions.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think that's right. I think for many publications around the country at the moment, they're still fishing for a new business model to replace the one that no longer works. Um, I'm curious, as somebody who deals with members of the public who, come in for life coaching, for whatever, do they talk about journalism? Is this a source of stress that you hear from people in your current work?
Yeah, I mean, it does come up. Look, they're more likely to start with politics, like lots of chatter about the Supreme Court over the last few weeks. Um, People do talk about the news. They do talk about information. They do, it's funny too. A lot of my conversations about journalism start with really literacy about information, where people are concerned or worried about something, and then my natural question was, "Where did you read that?" "Oh, you read it there. Maybe you should." Da, 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 da. So, but I do think that there are worries about the profession too, like the narrowing of sources for reliable information. There was a lot of uncertainty in the Trump administration. People didn't know what to believe about anything. And I think it was comforting to people during that time to be able to point them to some places where you could get good information, but at the same time, those places also seem under threat. I mean, we need Jeff Bezos to hold up one of them, right? So, you know,
Yeah, it's interesting. Um, it leads me to another place though, where I've been sometimes with folks, which is is there a greater responsibility on the part of the public to sort through the information that floods them and find credible sources?
I do. I think that that's really true. I think it is true. And I think, you know, that's something that a lot of us learned when we were young and we figured out because other people pointed us in the right direction or but I think the problem now for a lot of the young people is that, 90% of what's out there, I'm not saying isn't credible, but not necessarily reliably credible. The search to figure it out is a lot harder now for a young person who does not have somebody who knows the answer to the question. So I do think that they have an obligation. And I think some of them are aware of the need to do it. I think some of them are not aware of the need to do it. For a lot of people, the difference between a Facebook post and a news story is, here or there. And so I think that there needs to probably be some time and literacy over these issues. I'm actually kind of surprised that people don't pick it up in college,
Hmm.
but I do think it's their responsibility. I also think, jumping back to your other point about the business model, I think, when I talk to people about the news business struggling financially, most and same thing when I talk to them about Google and how it works, they don't know how these organizations make money. They don't understand. They don't understand why journalism isn't rolling in, piles and piles of dough. Yes.
Yeah. Question, have you had clients who are reporters? The questioner says we're exposed to trauma, danger, and job insecurity, and small local news organizations can't offer the resources of a New York Times.
Yes. So to answer your question, I have had journalists come to me, both as clients and not as clients, dealing with some of these issues. I think a touchstone for me with many journalists who either experienced it or went through experiences similar. So by the time I was 27, I think I had seen something in the neighborhood of like 260, 270 dead bodies. Plane crashes, train derailment where kids were run over, dead bodies sitting in the street from a shooting. I remember standing over a dead body with a cop, trading Pez, going, oh, fuck, I've been doing this too long. And I didn't think anything odd about it. Actually, up until last year, I didn't think anything odd about it, but I was sitting down talking to my therapist and we were talking about life experiences. She's like, you realize that's a lot of unnatural death? But you've got 9/11, you've got two wars, you've got the wars that were happening before that. That's a lot of trauma for people to not get help. And actually, the counselor who helped me at the Times, they had an employee assistance counselor. She actually started a practice that focuses nothing on nothing other than helping journalists manage their trauma. But I think one of the things that makes it really hard for journalists to manage their trauma is you guys are expected to deal with traumatic things over and over again, to the point where maybe you become numb to them, but it doesn't really matter because the next day you're expected to jump to the next thing. So it's like watching 1,000 car crashes where people are injured in a row and not being able to ever stop to process your feelings. And that stuff is eventually going to leak out. It's eventually going to affect your lives, marriages, whatever it is. And so I think, the organizations creating the space and the awareness around it, like even if you don't have the resources of the Times, you can educate your workforce about some of these risks. You could be honest with college students about some of these risks, being able to give yourself time and space to manage those challenges. And I think that would make a world of difference if people just knew up front that that's a big piece of doing the job. So.
Yeah. And while we don't, we don't offer anything that's complete comprehensive by any means, I'd always have to point out SPJ has returned to this subject time and time again at conferences and through information and connections that we make for folks online. So it's another reason to be part of the group, if you will. Another question from Rod. In the past couple of years, I've referenced you in stories at least twice. And he writes, just curious how you emotionally handle being such an infamous figure in American journalism, talked about in college classes and frequently mentioned in the media when journalism ethics does come up.
At first, not too well. I think that certainly in the beginning, particularly when, the first however many years after a big event happens, you're trying to process it and trying to figure it out. And all you have there in that moment is the loss. I think it was particularly difficult. I think over time, though, as I grew and gained more perspective, right? What I know about why it happened yesterday is not going to be as robust as what I'm going to know tomorrow. It's a continuous growing process. But I think the combination of being able to A, see some good out of it, B, go back and give some good to the community makes it a little bit easier. I sort of view it as like my obligation, right? I committed sins, and part of my penance is to go have uncomfortable conversations, sort of like this one, with people about journalism in ways that can help. So I think for me, it's not like I'm looking for absolution, right? It's not like I'm trying to make myself feel better by doing these things. But I think one of the side effects of doing these things, because it's the right thing to do, is that it's a little bit easier to deal with. I do not like to see my name in the newspaper. Friends and family will tell me to avoid things. Not that I need to. So it's not like I'm happy about it. It's not like I'm looking for it. But I think it's made easier by this aspect of it.
Well, I am kind of was kind of curious to hear you say that because it does have to be difficult, and it would and you have done it repeatedly over the years. And I do find that kind of interesting. I imagine you are getting something out of it because it would
Oh
certainly
yeah,
be easy
right.
enough to avoid.
Yeah. Yeah. No, what I get out of it is, like I said in the beginning, journalism is a monumentally important profession. There's a reason why it's the only one mentioned in the Constitution. And so when you go and you do damage, right? Because if you look at the ultimate impact, let's go big picture beyond me. And the ultimate impact of what I did was big picture was damage the credibility of a super important institution to democracy, to more broad freedom, to people's ability to be informed and trust. I think when you do that kind of damage, yeah, I mean, even in 2016, Donald Trump was using my name to attack the New York Times. So, but when you do that kind of damage, I think you do have a duty and obligation to give back. And I think for me, I do get something out of that. Not that I can wipe it away or take it away, but I can bring a tiny bit of positiveness back or gain a little ground or help one or two journalists or, yeah, help a journalism student prepare anything.
You mentioned Donald Trump, and I'm curious because Jay Rosen, a professor at NYU, has put this out there for the last several years. His contention is that Trump and other politicians have been kind of waging an asymmetric war on the press. And his contention is doing what we have always done is no longer sufficient. And what I've wondered for the last several years is, well, what else do we do as journalists?
I think it's a tough one. I think that there are definitely things that, I mean, and I'm sure many of you guys agree with this, there were things during the 2016 campaign that not taking Trump seriously, doing the both sides thing, and even when he was saying something absolutely insane, they didn't necessarily fit the situation. But that's not about objectivity, right? Like I guess you're kind of getting at the idea of the camp of people who are like, let's throw out objectivity. Yeah, that does you no good because it undermines your credibility
Mhm.
more than I ever could have. So to me, I think that a lot of people want the press to solve problems that the press is not supposed to solve, that politics is really supposed to solve. The press is supposed to give us that information to make informed decisions. And if all of a sudden the press becomes the attack dog that we can't trust, then we truly will not live in a reality-based world because people won't even believe the things that are coming from the reality-based people. So I think it's a matter of like, there's desperation for the press to solve problems it's not designed to solve.
Yeah, which maybe brings us back to whether or not it's to some degree up to the public to navigate this road more than it is ours to do anything differently. Interesting.
But if you think about it, it's you all, it's the journalists who give us that information to make informed decisions. Without that, we can't do it. That's your part.
Mhm.
And then we have to run with the ball. And I think I can understand why some journalists are frustrated that the information is getting out there and we as the public are not running with the ball, but that's also our choice too. So
Yeah. And what if anything? I mean, well, I mean, again, as someone who works with individuals in and help them deal with their current environment, talk to us a little bit about social media and how you tell people to navigate that wild and crazy world that's out there.
I prefer they not. No, I mean, we long before the scandal with Facebook and Instagram, with the problems with eating disorders that were coming up in teens, like we were already seeing those things. We've been seeing those things like from a clinical perspective for years. One of the biggest challenges with any social media for us in our space is just people comparing themselves to unrealistic versions, the marketing versions of other people that are there. So there are a lot of like mental health issues, self-esteem issues, attachment issues, driven by social media. So that's one bucket. There's a ton of misinformation on social media. Like doctors hated it when WebMD was invented because everybody became a doctor. Well, now everybody's become an everything because of Twitter. And to your point about journalism, that for a young person growing up right now, that tweet has the same weight as that news story from CNN or wherever it is. And I think that leads to some of the problems around information, but it also leads to much broader problems around their house. So to navigate it, we generally encourage, at least in my mind, I generally encourage people who are, I will talk to them when it comes to social media and they bring it up about going to informed sources. I will talk to them about comparing themselves to other people. You're comparing yourself to a marketing magazine, not real life. And I think in general, like we've become, unfortunately, like overly reliant on it. There is nothing in the world that has more power than Facebook. That is insane. It's more powerful than most governments. And it has an enormous negative impact on the world. Pause for a second. Yes, it has an enormous, powerful impact on the world, but it doesn't, by comparison to, let's say, journalism profession, it doesn't have any ethical mooring, right? Like Facebook and its algorithms and its leadership, may have played a role in the Arab Spring. They also played a role in the genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar. And the exact same way, exact same techniques, exact same pieces. So I from a journalism perspective, I think if a greater emphasis can be put on exploring how we're going to live with social media from a mental health, information, political, financial perspective, we'd probably all benefit from it.
All right, I've got another question here in the chat, and I will say I'm about out of my questions, so go
Okay.
ahead and add to this list if you like as we wind up. It's been a lot of discussion about objectivity and the press not being objective anymore. What is your interpretation of objectivity in journalism, and do we need a new paradigm to understand objectivity that includes different perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do. I would maybe whoever asked that question could follow up a little bit more, but I do
Okay.
think you guys have a paradigm right now that includes different perspectives. I think that it seems like to me, the argument is really about point of view versus straight journalism. Now, one of the challenges of straight journalism that's existed for a long time has been like both sides, equal play, all that kind of stuff. I do think that there are things that people can do in objective journalism to not give ridiculous things the same space as they do completely logical things, or likely things, right? But for the most part, taking a certain point of view on issues actually, to me, takes away some of the powers of journalism. How I understand, for example, Southern racists is because some journalists went down there and interviewed them, found out about their lives, found out about their experiences, found out about the first time the guy saw a black guy. It was during the riots. Well, that information helps me bridge a gap. I don't need journalists to go attack that dude. I need to know what that dude's story is so we can close gaps between us. So in my mind, there is a space for that. There's a space for that point of view stuff, and it's on the opinion page. It's politicians. There needs to be a space where we're trying to understand just our best version of the truth. Does that answer the question?
Well, let's see if, again, if
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, yeah, I'm doing my dissertation. That's one of the topics, how Black journalists envision objectivity. So I've been talking to journalists, particularly because of the social justice movement and some criticisms that have come as it relates to coverage.
Yep.
But I'm just interested in hearing what African-American journalists think about journalism and this whole ideal of objectivity. So
yeah, and it's a tough one because I think that there's nothing wrong with a news organization having values, having things that it cares about. Every time you decide to cover a certain story, that's an expression of your values. But there's a choice to cover that story fairly or not. And I think that even in independent journalism, you can choose to cover it fairly or objectively or not, and then add your opinion to it. But I think that's the important role that journalism plays in society, that I can rely on it for the truth, and then I can make my own decisions. I don't need to be told how I need to feel by a journalist. Just give me the info and I'll figure it out.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying too that I never can, and a lot of my fellow journalists really can't stand the word objectivity, because if you define it the way the dictionary does, there's no way any of us can be objective. We can be fair, we can try to be balanced when that's necessary, we can try to avoid false equivalence, which is what Jayson was talking about a few moments ago, the idea that
I think it's the pursuit.
All that sort of.
Irvin, I think it's the pursuit of objectivity. It's not about being objective. Like when I walk into, if you walk into a story, you bringing all of who you are into that story, but it's about being self-aware,
right,
and being able to sort of factor out some of your unconscious biases. Look at, I mean, and sometimes those biases cause you to ask the best questions.
Yeah, and I think most of us can do that. It's just the word, I think, sometimes creates an unrealistic expectation.
Doesn't work well on Twitter.
Yeah, no, it doesn't.
Well, let me ask you, if you don't mind me asking another
Sure,
question.
go ahead.
Where do you see the future of this? And the reason why I ask is because, I was a journalist, and right around the time that we had to start getting Facebook accounts, that's, our company made us do that. And a lot of us old schoolers didn't want to do that because we didn't want to mix we knew what it was leading to. Conversation with the readers, but then starting to add our opinions on there. And with social media, it's almost as if that's where things are flowing. Television, radio stations, and even newspapers. Now you see more commenting from reporters. Are we drifting to a point of no return where we will start mixing more of our opinions with our writing?
Hope not.
Yeah,
I
I
think
agree
we
with
are.
you. Although the two things that I would throw out there that I think are interesting. One is that in talking to a lot of younger people, I'm not sure they value the striving for objectivity the way we do. I think I have heard from some of them that they essentially feel it's almost dishonest for journalists to not reveal their biases and opinions about things, which is an interesting way of trying to analyze where people are coming from. You know, it's this idea that we need to be more transparent about what they know are our feelings rather than simply assuming that we're these neutral third observers. But then the other thing, Jason, and I'm just having fun now for a few moments, is that, you know, when we think about the First Amendment, which we all love dearly, the First Amendment was never written for an organization like the New York Times, which didn't exist. I mean, it was written to protect Thomas Paine's pamphlet. It was written to protect old newspapers like the Massachusetts Spy that were a complete mixture of opinion and news. That's the press that the First Amendment was actually written to protect.
Yeah, but I don't think our founders are like absolute gods.
No,
I think
no, I
that
mean,
journalism evolved into
yeah.
this.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
and I do think, I mean, the First Amendment protects all sorts of things that don't fit within the quote unquote
Mhm.
objective journalist bucket. And I see the argument for people wanting to know more about what people think. But I think being in the profession, I recognize that what you may think about something may not play much of a role in what you write. And that might be hard for people to believe. But I think we evolved into this type of journalism for a very important reason. Particularly in a country with such a powerful executive administrative state, that the vast majority of government decisions happen in regulations behind closed doors in the executive branch. Like, someone needs to be reporting the facts.
Mhm.
It's happening.
Agreed. I've got a couple more questions here,
Yep.
but I want to take Mary Crowley Farrell's first. The students I have who are Gen Z through millennials in age, working on their degrees while in jobs and raising families, say they don't believe in objectivity. They grew up on a diet of analysis. They have trouble writing about facts without opinions. They do not give objectivity the same weight as earlier generations of journalists. They care about consensus on the facts and do not hesitate to vote up or down on the truth of a fact on Reddit. And goes on to say, this troubles me greatly because it's easier to manipulate people who think that way. Interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
I
Well,
think
here,
Adam had a question in there.
yes, he does. And it's an excellent question to end on, I think. Yeah, Adam asks, are there any stories you worked on before the scandal at the Times that you were particularly proud of?
Yes. Probably a lot, actually, and not just at the Times, but one of my favorite stories was going into Ground Zero with the Oklahoma City Mayor Kirk Humphreys and his family, with the firefighters, with some of the firefighters had gone to Oklahoma City for the bombing. And one of the most interesting things about this story is his whole point was take care of your mental health. So I feel like that's a good note. I enjoyed working on, and I mean, what his real point in that story was. I know you guys are worried about the buildings. I know you're worried about the death. I know you're worried about the cost, but what you should really be worried about is people's mental health. I should have like taken a hint from that. But there were other stories, you know, this series of stories I did with Chris Drew on these Hispanic workers who kept on getting killed doing construction in a politically connected neighborhood in New York, created real reform and change. I tend to gravitate toward the stories that had that kind of impact. But the Oklahoma City story for me, I think is just one of the most meaningful ones.
Okay, great. Let me take a moment first to thank everybody who participated this evening, who joined us, asked some really good questions. Jayson, of course, thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Let me I'll throw my email address in there. I know Rod, you left your phone number and I'll try and pull it, but that's my email address. If anybody wants to reach out, has any questions, wants to yell at me, I'm cool with it. I appreciate your graciousness. I know sometimes it's hard for people to tolerate me given my history, but I hope I had some kind of helpful impact for you guys.
It is what it is. Thank you again.
It can be good.
Oh, I think this, well, look, you know, I'm reminded of, I mean, there's really, I mean, some information is misinformation, but there's, at the end of the day, if it's something like this, there's really no bad information to be had. It's all worthwhile, and it's all something we can learn on. And by the way, the old saw is true, as I'm sure, Jayson, you would agree. We learn more from our mistakes than from anything else we do.
I agree. I agree.
All right.
It looks like my email didn't show up for everyone. I'm going to go ahead and drop it in again. Oh, I just sent it to Rod. My bad. Did it show up for you guys now? Cool.
All right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, very much. Appreciate it.
It was nice to meet you guys. Good luck with everything. Continue to do the great things you're doing. We really need you out here. So
good night.
Thank you.
And there we go. So, Rod, what did you think?
I thought it was a good discussion,
I thought so too.
and I appreciated him being so candid.
Yeah, well, I went back and looked at some video of him talking to Washington and Lee.